We're on page 46a, and we had learned about the bracha B'nei Barachim of Yerushalayim Amen, the third bracha of the benching, that the Amen is an argument if you should say it out loud or quietly. And the reason was, out loud was in order to tell the workers that they are exempt from saying the final bracha. And that is based on an earlier Gemara that we learned on page 16, where it talks about the workers, that there are two types of workers. There's the workers that work for money, and there's workers that are just working to have a meal. If they're working simply to have a meal, and the owner doesn't pay them a salary, he just gives them food, gives them their meal, then he does not obligate them to skip some of the benching. They have to bench fully because it's not like he's spending so much money on them. They're cheap labor. So he's got to let them do the full benching and the full davening. But if he's getting away with, if he's not getting away with just giving them meal, he's actually paying them a salary, then they have more of an obligation, and to minimize their extra rituals in order to satisfy their boss, and therefore they would skip some of the benching, and they would also skip some of the davening. It says they would say the Me'ein Yurches, the bridged Shmones, and a bridged Shmona Esrei as well. And that was based on a Gemara we learned together on page 16. Our Gemara mentioned that the reason to say Amen out loud was because what it actually was, the purpose of it was to announce to the workers that they are exempt from saying the fourth bracha, which is considered only of rabbinic nature, at least according to the way the Gemara understands here. And this was done by Abaye. Abaye ani le'b'kola, he answered the Amen out loud. It says Rav Ashi would answer it quietly, and the reason he would answer it quietly was because he was nervous that people might come to consider the final bracha not so important. It's not such a significant bracha, because he might say that the bracha, even the workers don't have to say it. It's obviously not so important. This is the end. The Amen is said at the end of the group of brachas, so this is afterwards. So obviously it's not so significant. And therefore Rav Ashi would say it quietly. He would say it because it is after a group of brachas that are biblical, and at the end of a group of brachas, it is appropriate to say Amen. And this is a group of brachas that are combined together. But at the same time, it would cause, if he said it out loud, it would cause people to consider it insignificant, and therefore he said it quietly. Now Tosfos over here mentions that the appropriate thing to do nowadays is to say it quietly, because he says that nowadays we don't have workers that have the rules of workers, and therefore even Abaye would agree here. Even Abaye, who would say the Amen out loud, that was only then. But in today's day, we don't have the laws of this law of workers minimizing their Shmona Esrei, minimizing their grace after meal. And the truth is, the grace after meal, what I'm mentioning, that they left out the fourth bracha, we actually learned yesterday that they also minimized they also summarized one of the earlier brachas, and they combined the second and third bracha together. So it wasn't just excluding the fourth bracha, but it also meant that they combined the second and third bracha as well. So there was the way it was done was they minimized the benching. Now I did see in Shulchan Aruch that it brings down that Vehoidna, nowadays, this is in chapter 191 in Shulchan Aruch, it brings down, and nowadays, Li'olam mevarchin kol arba brachas. We always say all four brachas because ein derech she'ein derech b'nei adam achshav. People aren't careful nowadays lahakbid b'kach, to be so strict about this, meaning that their workers should not spend an extra 2 minutes to finish the benching properly. People aren't strict. And probably with this in mind, they hire workers, even though they're paying them money, which is the case where they normally would be exempt. But he says that they're hiring workers with the intent that they're going to say all four brachas kitikunam as they are established, meaning properly, and not skip out. So that's the reason nowadays that we don't have this law doesn't apply, and workers do the full benching. Now it's interesting that so according to that, it would seem that we should say it quietly because you don't have that logic of telling the workers that they're exempt, right? So it would make sense to say it quietly. However, interestingly enough, the Ramah writes in a different chapter, 188. He says it seems that only when you're benching alone that you should say it quietly. But when others are mizamim with you, so you could say amen, like you could say amen just like the people answering, when they're answering with you, they're answering amen out loud. Everyone else is answering. You could also answer because it's not going to be recognizable that since others are answering with you, it's not a problem to say it out loud. And so is the custom. You could say it out loud. Even the person who's saying the benching, you could say it out loud. And maybe that's the reason, because others are answering with you. So it's not a problem to say it out loud. And the Mishnah Berurah brings down the only time people would minimize the importance of the fourth bracha was in the time that the workers used to be exempt from it. But now that the workers aren't exempt from it, we don't have to worry that people are going to minimize the importance. Because even the workers say the four brachas. So according to this, even if you benched alone, you could say amen out loud. And that would seem to be the minhag, the Mishnah Berurah writes. So it comes out that the Taisus over here writes you should say it quietly. The Mechaber, the Beis Yosef of the Shulchan Aruch, says to say amen quietly. The Ramah says maybe if you're benching alone, you should say it quietly. If you're benching with a mezumin, say it out loud. And the Mishnah Berurah writes you can always say it out loud. So you have all the extremes, all options are placed on the table for you. So that's the law. That's with regard to amen of the Beinei Barachim of Yushalayim. Amen. Now the next on the next page, page 46a, we did yesterday, and we mentioned about the story of Reb Zera. Reb Zera was sick. And Reb Avo said, you know what? If you get better, I'm going to donate a whole meal. We're going to have a whole festive meal for all the Rabbanon, which means the rabbis, the students. And sure enough, he got better. So Reb Avo kept his promise, and he made a festive meal for all the Rabbanon. And the question was, who should break bread? So that was the first question. The second question was, who should do the benching? And it's quite a complicated story with regard to the fact that each of them seem to have sources. The Gemara mentions that Reb Avohu wanted Reb Zera to break bread, but Reb Zera said, no, the Baal Habayis is supposed to be the one to break bread. So fine. So Reb Avohu, who's the Baal Habayis means the host. So who's the host? Well, Reb Avohu is paying for the meal. Reb Zera was the one who's sick. It's in his honor. So Reb Zera said, "You're the host because you're paying for the meal, so you should break bread." So he did. That was the Gemara that Reb Avo broke bread. Now, when it came to benching, you have another debate over here, another issue. So Reb Avo wants Reb Zera to bench. So he says, "What do you mean? I bench? You broke bread. You bench. The person who's Baitseya, the one who breaks bread, he does the benching." So that was based on a statement of Rav Huna that you're supposed to, the person who breaks bread, he benches. Then the Gemara said, what was Reb Avo thinking? Reb Avo offered Reb Zera to bench. What was he thinking? Right? He didn't know Rav Huna's statement. So the Gemara says he holds like Rav Yochanan in the name of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai that the owner breaks bread, but the guest does the benching. So he follows a different. It seems like the Gemara is implying like he follows a different opinion, that the guest is the one who does the benching, and the Gemara explains why. That the host breaks the bread because we want the person to break bread with an ayin yafa. Ayin yafa means a good eye, and which means he'll give a proper amount to all the guests. So he'll give a nice amount. He'll give it with a good eye. When you give it with a bad eye, it means you're stingy. You give them a tiny little piece. If you give it with a good eye, it means you give in abundance. So the balabayas will give it in abundance. So he's the one who's supposed to break bread because he'll give in abundance. The guest is the one who's supposed to do the grace after meal. Why does the guest do the grace after meal? Because there's a whole Yehi Ratzah, and there's a special prayer he says for the host, and that prayer that he shouldn't get embarrassed in this world and the next world, and it says the Rebbe used to even add to that prayer, and he would say he should be successful and all these things, and so on. The Satan shouldn't have any effect on his actions, and he shouldn't have any bad thoughts, and so any thoughts of sin, and so forever and ever. And so because there's a special prayer to say, better that the guest should do the benching. That's what Reb Avohu thought. He should have Reb Zera do the benching. Now Reb Zera followed Rav Huna, who says that the person who breaks bread, he does the benching. So the question is, so what's the logic behind all these views? So the one to break bread, the host is supposed to break bread. Why? So we said because he's going to do with a positive, with a good eye. Why is he going to give it with a good eye? And if it's a guest, he's not going to. So yesterday I explained one reason, and that is that the person who's lives there, who's the host, so he's not afraid. He's always going to have food. The guests that are always, they're nervous. I'm not going to give away everything. If I cut 2 big pieces, guess what? I'll be stuck with a tiny little crumb at the end. So therefore, let me give small little tiny pieces to everyone, and then I'll be fine. But the host, not afraid. Okay, I won't have any food for myself. No problem. I go into the kitchen. I know where the freezer is. I know where I can always find stuff there. The guest doesn't have access over there. So that is one of the reasons that's given. The other reason that's given, I didn't mention it yesterday, is that when a guest cuts bread for the participants, if he cuts too big of pieces, the host is going to look at him. You're just a guest over here. You're giving away all my food. Like it's embarrassing. He's embarrassed to give too much because it's not even his. He's pretending. Well, you baked it. You own it. It's yours. I just honored you to cut the bread, but he's a little embarrassed to give such big pieces because it implies as if he feels too comfortable over there in the seat. He's pretending to be the balabayas. He's pretending. So therefore, the owner, he is not embarrassed. He'll give big pieces, no problem. But the guest is embarrassed to give 2 big pieces because he feels that it's not appropriate for him to cut such big pieces. So that's the 2 reasons given why the host is supposed to break the bread. Now, I want to take those 2 reasons and bring that back to the story that we have here. Why did Reb Avohu want Reb Zera to break the bread? The Gemara says he wasn't supposed to. Reb Zera is not supposed to break the bread. The host is supposed to break the bread, right? Because Reb Avohu is the one paying for the meal. He's the host. He's arranging the whole meal. So he's the one who's supposed to break bread. So that makes sense. He's supposed to break bread, and he did in the end. But what was his thought? What was his initial thought that he wanted Reb Zera to break the bread? So on a simple level, you could say that he was just honoring him. It's a special honor. And there is a commentary over here that mentions that if someone is greater than you, you're supposed to honor him, that these laws don't apply to someone who's much extra special. Someone who's extra special, then you're really supposed to give them the honor. So these are some of the options of how we could explain why Reb Avohu wanted Reb Zera to do the breaking of the bread. However, you could say there is another explanation, and that is that who is really the host? When you make a meal in honor of someone else, maybe they are considered the host. Balabayas breaks the bread. Who's the host? Is the host the one who's paying? If you think about money matter, if money is everything, then the host is the one who's paying. But if you're not thinking about the money aspect and you want to know who's the real host, you could say that Reb Zera, it's all in his honor, he's really the host in this meal. And he should maybe break bread because he's the host. It's all for him. So he's really the balabayas. Again, not financially, but in the perspective of it's all because of him. It's his meal. This whole meal only is taking place because of him. He's the balabayas. So could be that Reb Avohu thought that he's the one who's supposed to do the breaking of the bread because it's all in his honor, and he's the balabayas. Now, what's the reason of the balabayas breaking the bread? So we had two reasons. So if the reason is because the balabayas is nervous, he's not going to have enough for himself after because he doesn't live there and it's not. So Reb Zera would not be the balabayas here. It's not his house. Who knows how far away he lives? He might still be nervous. Logically, in other words, he might not give with a good. He's not going to be stingy. But he might not have that same comfort of giving with a good eye because he's a little concerned about he does want to eat something, and so therefore it would seem that he's not the balabayas, even though the meal is in his honor. However, the other reason, if you think about the other reason, what's the other reason? The other reason is that he feels wrong to be too generous because he's not the balabayas. Maybe, and this is just a thought, maybe if you think about it that way, in this case, Reb Zera is the balabayas. It's all in his honor. The host wants him to give as generous as he can because the whole meal is for him. The whole meal is in his honor. He could be as generous as possible. Therefore, Reb Avohu said, you're the balabayas here. You should be the one breaking the bread. Because I have no problem. You're going to do it with a good eye. Why? Because it's all in your honor. You could give big pieces. You don't have to be embarrassed. I'm paying for the whole meal for you to get this honor. And therefore, Reb Avohu felt that Reb Zera should break the bread. Reb Zera said, no, you're physically you're the balabayas, and maybe because of the other reason of what a balabayas has he's not nervous at all. He'll have a much better eye. Whatever the reason was, he followed what Reb Zera said. But that could be the reason why he's considered that there was a thought that he should be considered the balabayas in this case, based on the other explanation of why the balabayas is Beitzea. Now, then the Gemara asks, well, what was his reason for? The Gemara concluded that there's two ways, there's two opinions over here. It seems like there's the Rav Huna opinion that the person who breaks bread does the grace after meal, and there's the Rabbi Yochanan and the name of Shimon Bar Yochai that the guest is supposed to do the grace after meal. Now, what's interesting is Tosfos over here, which is a subject of a debate among the commentaries, but Tosfos over here does say that at least the one way of learning Tosfos, I should say, is that these two statements, Rav Huna's statement and Rabbi Yochanan's statement, are not necessarily contradictory. Like, you could follow both. In other words, obviously Reb Zera didn't think that way. Reb Zera followed what Rav Huna said, and Reb Avo had thought of what Reb Yochanan said. But if we want to follow both, you can. And how do you follow both? So Tosfos says, well, when the Bala Bayis is the one is eating with you, then you got to let him break bread. But the guest would do the benching, as Rabbi Yochanan said. But when the Balabayas is not eating with you, and you're honoring one of the guests with breaking bread, then you got to let him do the grace after meal. Why? Because the grace after meal that is done, it'll be an embarrassment if you give it to another guest, because it makes it look somehow that, the first guy didn't do a good job in the breaking bread blessing, and now you're giving it to another person to have you're giving away that honor to a different person. Let the same guy who got the honor for the breaking bread, let him do the grace after meal as well, to show him, to not embarrass him as if he didn't do a good job in his the way he was leading. And therefore, if the Balabayas is the one who's breaking bread, then you want specifically the guest, because he needs to say this extra bracha, which honors the Balabayas. So therefore you let someone else do the benching so that the guest can say the special praise and request for the benefit of the Balabayas. But if it's a guest anyway who's breaking bread because the host is not eating with you, then you let him do the grace after meal, and he could add that extra blessing for the host, even though the host is not eating with you, but he could add that blessing for the host as well. But the main point is that he shouldn't be embarrassed that you're taking away the blessing from him and letting someone else do the blessing. It's
Rabbi.
Shouldn't be embarrassed. Okay.
Rabbi, could I ask a question?
I'm not sure who's first.
Yeah, but I was holding my hand up.
Ben?
Yeah. I wanted to say everybody at that dinner, at that meal, knows exactly who paid for it and who the Balabayit is. So the reasoning that they give doesn't make a difference. The Balabayit has his rights and the Oreach that paid has his rights. Either one of them can do both without shaming anybody.
Yeah, but the Gemara, the understanding is that it has to do with the ayin yafa. The Gemara says that word ayin yafa.
The one that paid can have an ayin yafa, and the Balabait can have an ayin yafa because he knows it's in his honor.
Not exactly.
So,
he might be hungry. He might be left with no food. Depends on it depends on what country the host is, the person who paid for the meal is from, or who the caterer is.
Yeah,
if they give abundantly is one thing. If the caterer gives the 4 ounce piece of chicken, only 4 ounces per person, so then you're going to leave hungry. And if you give a little too much to one person, you're going to be stuck with nothing.
So that's up to him, how much he wants to give.
But he doesn't know how.
For both of them. It's not.
No, it's not.
I can't see the difference.
Because the host is not nervous at all. He could always sneak into the kitchen and steal something from the oven that his wife is baking. He could always grab something when his wife isn't looking. He always be able. What?
You mean the Balabai?
The Balabayas, yeah.
Yeah.
You can always get something. He'll have something. He's not afraid. He also knows where the cookies are hidden, and he knows so he can eat
but when he portions
25
it out,
cookies and
when he
what?
portions it out, if he feels short, he should be careful. That's all. But
that's the
reason is
thing.
for both of them.
But the host won't need to be as careful because he's not nervous about himself. It's one less person to be concerned about.
I don't know. I can't see it.
Okay, fine. Yes, Simone.
So at a wedding, the parents generally are paying for the food, but
Right.
the groom is the person that breaks the bread and leads the benching.
Interesting. That's an interesting thought. So who should really break the bread at the wedding? You're saying maybe let me just figure this out here. Mute everyone. You're saying, according to this, the host, which is the parents should really break the bread. The problem is you'll have a whole fight between the Kala's parents and the Chassan's parents. So therefore, here it's better to rely on the other view, that it's in his honor to break the bread. You let the Chassan, but
then somebody
maybe
else should lead the benching, so in order to bless them.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, that's true. It doesn't say clearly who leads the benching. The problem is that nowadays not everyone does that extra benching. And let me just see. In chapter 201, it probably mentions that blessing. I'm guessing chapter 201, it would say, my time is almost up. Let me just see one thing there. So it does say it in Shulchan Aruch that he should say this bracha, Yehi Ratzon, if the Baal Habayis doesn't care about the bracha and he wants to do his own benching, he could do it himself. And the same thing is he could give it to anyone who he wants. So it's not like a halacha that he had. So here you have that the Baal Habayis could just keep the benching. It's just they established it that for the benefit of the Baal Habayis. The rabbis said that the Oirach should bench for the benefit of the Baal Habayis. If the Baal Habayis doesn't care about that bracha, so then he could do the benching himself. So there's no question about that. But your question about the breaking the bread, I think the answer also is that when you just make a meal for someone is one thing, that it doesn't really necessitate him to break bread. But here it's the meal, it's a wedding, and you're making this, the chassan is the king. So here it could be that this law doesn't apply, that the Beitseya, the Baal Habayis benches, because you have a king in front of you, and it's all about lifting him up. So therefore, it maybe wouldn't apply. That's my thought. Okay.
So it is very similar. It is very similar in that here in our Gemara, it's in somebody's honor, and the wedding, in a sense, is in their honor also.
Yeah, but he's not a king. And it's and I'm, in addition to the fact that besides being a king, in addition to that, I see it differently for a chassan and kala for a wedding than a meal that's in someone's honor. To me, I don't know. I see a difference there. That the chassan, it's the parents want, the Baal Habayis wants that the chassan should do the grace. He's becoming making a household. We want him to be. It's all about making him into a Baal Habayis. The wedding is all about making him into being the Baal Habayis, the host. So therefore, he should be the one to break the bread. That's my thought. Okay. So anyway, the Gemara continues. Did I miss anyone? Did anyone else have a question? Okay. Don't see. Okay. So the Gemara continued, and we mentioned Rashi's explanation of the Gemara, which we really should go over. And the problem is it's so little time. Does anyone have extra time? Does anyone need to leave? Can everyone stay for a little extra? You have to leave, Simone? You have to leave. Okay. So let me just go over a little of Rashi, and then we'll stop there. And tomorrow, Mitzvah Hashem will do Tosfos. So Rashi had explained the Gemara to mean that we're dealing with the issue of saying the grace after meal with a mezumin, and does the mezumin incorporate the first bracha of the grace after meal? And the thing is, it's a very surprising understanding. What the Gemara is asking, until where is the berachas hazimun? Where does the zimun end? And the way that Rashi is understanding it is, the zimun end after a few sentences. You say responsively, is that the end right there, or do the first paragraph of the benching also part of the zimun? Rav Nachman says it's not part of the zimun. The zimun is only those sentences back and forth. Let us say the grace. Okay, we'll say the grace together, and so on. That's it. Then you have the first part of the benching, which logically Rav Nachman makes more sense according to us. That because of course we even if you don't do a zimun, we say that first bracha. Now Rav Sheshis argues, and he says no, the first bracha of the benching is really part of the zimun. It's not part of the grace after meal. It's part of the zimun. If you don't have a zimun, you don't have three people, you actually skip out that first bracha, according to Rav Sheshis. Now that's very surprising, this explanation, because Rashi is interpreting it this way, but the problem is Rav Sheshis, the halacha should follow Rav Sheshis versus Rav Nachman. Now, if the halacha follows Rav Sheshis versus Rav Nachman, which it should be, that would come out that we should really only say we should start at Noida Lecha, all of our benchings, if we don't have a zimun. And together with a few other questions, that this bothers Tosfos greatly. Therefore, in other commentaries as well, therefore they want to give a whole different explanation here. But I'm not going to go into the other explanation. But let's just go through this point, these few points of Rav Nachman or Rav Sheshis, the way Rashi learns it. So that the Gemara says that it seems like there's an argument among earlier rabbis of the Tanoim, because they there seems to be two brises. One says that Berachas Hamazon is 2 and 3 blessings. Another brisa says that Berachas Hamazon is 3 and 4 blessings. So the Gemara thinks, this makes sense. Let's forget about the final bracha that's rabbinic of the benching, and let's just talk about the first few brachas of the benching. And what comes out is that there's either 2 or 3 blessings, or there's 3 and 4, and it would make sense. If there's 2 or 3 blessings, that would mean that that would follow Rav Sheshis, right? Seems like that makes sense. There's 2 or 3. In other words, if there's no zimun, then you only have 2 blessings that are biblical, because the first blessing is part of the zimun. So if you don't have a zimun, so you only have 2 blessings. If you have a zimun, you have that zimun blessing, which is all inclusive. It's including the first blessing of the grace after meal, and it includes the zimun. It's 1. So you either have 2 or 3 blessings according to Rav Sheshis. That fits that brisa. The other brisa talks about 3 or 4. So he's talking about the simple understanding. You have 3 blessings that are biblical in the benching, and you have the 4th, which is if you have a zimun, you have 4. So that's the way the Gemara understood the 2 arguments. Seem to be the same arguments. There's an argument among the rabbis of the Mishnah, and the same argument is among the rabbis of the Talmud. They seem to be arguing about the same thing. The Gemara is not satisfied with that, because it's strange to have the 2 rabbis arguing about something that earlier rabbis argued with. Therefore, the Gemara says, no, each of the rabbis can say, I can explain these 2 brises, even according to my view. I'm not following only one of those earlier views. I'm following both of those earlier views, because I could explain both of them according to the way I understand benching. And the Gemara explains Rav Nachman, which is the simple view, that there's 3 blessings to grace after meal, and then there's a zimun on top of that, which is only a few lines. So Rav Nachman explains that everyone agrees that the zimun is only a few lines, and it doesn't include the first blessing. And then when you speak about 3 and 4 blessings, it makes sense that there's the 3 blessings of the benching, and the 4 would be if there's a zimun. Now, when the Brisa says 2 or 3 blessings of the benching, how would that work? So the answer is he's talking about Poyalim workers, and we're talking about workers, as I explained earlier, workers that only that are getting paid, and therefore they have to minimize their benching because they're getting paid in addition. They're getting paid to work, so therefore they have to work harder for their bala bias, for their owner, for their master, and therefore they have to skip and summarize the benching. So they bench with a zimun. There would only be 3 brachas because they summarize the second 2 bracha, the second and third bracha. They summarize them into one blessing. So therefore you have zimun, the first bracha, and the second and third in a summary. That's how you have 3. And if there's no zimun, then it's just the first bracha and the second and third in a summary, and then you have 2. That's Rav Nachman's way. Rav Sheshes had a different way of explaining it. That he says if the 2 and 3 is very simple, because I hold that the grace after meal, the first bracha is really part of the zimun. So if you have a zimun, you have the first bracha, which is part of the zimun. You have 3 people benching, so the first bracha is part of the zimun, and then you only have 2 brachas left. So that's how you have 3. And you have 2 as if you don't have a zimun, you only have 2 brachas because you skip the first bracha because that's part of the zimun. You don't have a zimun, you don't say it. And you don't say the bracha hazan hasakol, you start with naida lecha. That's the brisa with 2 or 3. And the if you say 3 and 4, how do you have 3 and 4 blessings of benching? Because he holds toiva hametiv is the araisa, is biblical, and therefore if that, according to that brisa, it's biblical to have the 4th blessing of the benching, and therefore what you have is 3 brachas of the 3 brachas that are if you hold 3 and 4, you hold hatoiv v'ametiv is daraisa. So you have you start with noida lecha, and you have noida lecha. You have b'nei barachim of Yerushalayim Amen. That's the second, and then you have hatoiv v'ametiv. That's 3, and then 4 would be with the zimun, which is including the first bracha, because that's the way Rav Sheshes learns. So that was the Rashi's explanation. We're going to stop here, and we'll do Taisus and Hashem tomorrow. Zayigazun to everyone. We'll see you later, Mr. Shem.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.